Hi.
Howdy.
Welcome to 15 to 15. Tonight, my subject, maybe a title, would be Catching Up on Poetry Written by Poets Who Are No Older Than My Own Children. And so that would mean that as I'm catching up with these younger poets, I
Want them to be younger than your children.
I don't know. That was a dependent clause, and I didn't know how to finish it. But so now, why would I do something like this? Well, there's a certain group of poets who became famous in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, and they were very important people like John Ashbury, A.R. Ammons is another one, and many others. But I'm realizing many of them have passed away. Like John Ashbury died at 90 2 years ago. He was a very old person.
Yeah.
But he'd been around since the 1950s.
But he was like famous since the 1950s.
He became sort of famous in the 60s, actually. And so
Okay.
anyhow,
he was born
these
in
were
like the 20s or something.
20 something, exactly. And I'd kept up with him and other people, and what I realized was it wasn't that easy for me to keep up with what younger poets were doing today, people, let's say, between the age of 25 and 50, for example. So I decided to have a project related to that. So here, one of my sources for that, to be able to keep in touch with them, is this annual collection that's called Best American Poetry. Like this was published in 2016, and some poet was commissioned to read tons of poetry magazines and journals and go even on the internet today for poetry that first appeared there, and then for this would be this person's choice of best poems of 2015 and this one of 2014. And so very often these would have poets who were born in the late 60s or early 1970s, or maybe even into the 1980s, some of them.
Okay.
So that was an important source.
And you're like subscribed to that, or that?
No, this
up?
is an annual thing. It'll come. I have just about every one you see on that shelf right there. I have the first one came out in 1988, and it was edited by John Ashbury. He was the one that did the choosing or something like that. Yeah, chosen.
So it's a book that comes out every year.
In August, in early September.
But you could probably submit to it now or something if we went to the website, or is it?
It hasn't been released.
Do you know how
yet.
it's curated?
Yes. This editor hires, you might say, a famous poet to actually spend the year reading just tons of poems, and then that person chooses 70 poems. And so this year it was Edward Hirsch. This year it was Sherman Alexie. Now, you know Sherman Alexie.
Yeah.
Now, I really respect Sherman Alexie. I think he's one of the most interesting poets in America, but he was born in 66, and he's slipped over. He's already slipped over into a little bit older than 50. So I recently...
He's 56?
54.
Okay.
You can see that he's just slipped over my line a little bit, but I will continue to read him. So I wanted to show you a batch of books of poems that I've purchased recently on Amazon. They're usually not that expensive. And so you can touch these and have a sense of who these people are. And I'm reading them and having a lot of fun. One of the poets is Amit Majmudar.
Cool.
And you can see, here's another book by Amit Majmudar. And I'm not going to say anything about these people as yet. Another one is Terence Hayes. And if you turn and look on the back, you'll see maybe a picture of him. Is there a picture of him? No, afraid not. Here's another one by Terence Hayes. A person I'm really getting into is Ben Lerner, who's also a novelist. Oh, here's a picture of Ben. Here is a book called How Narrow My Escapes by Lillian Yvonne Bertram, and you don't have any pictures of her, but all of these people are available to me on YouTube, and interviews and readings and documentaries about them, and I find other things. Natalie Diaz is a Mojave poet, and this is her book called When My Brother Was an Aztec. A very special person in our lives, my lives, is Travis Jeppeson, and he published this book called Poems I Wrote While Watching TV. And the pictures in it, they're more than illustrations, are done by Jeremiah Polachek. It's a beautiful book, I think, and I like including it as part because he's probably in his early 40s also.
Yes.
I recently got this collection called Legitimate Dangers, American Poets in the New Century. Most of this is filled with tons and tons of poems, and most of them are written by people who were born at least 1970 and after. There are a few late 60s, 65, but so there I'm really getting a dose, and it's fun to reconnect with all these people. Jennifer Chang, she's one of my most recent purchases. Some Say the Lark. There you can see a picture of her. I think I didn't pick up there's a book called Up Jump the Boogie by John Murillo. And I found a group of poems by him, John Murillo, called A Refusal to Mourn the Deaths by Gunfire of Three Men in Brooklyn. And it's one of the fascinating things, it starts with a quote from someone, and then there is a sonnet-length piece, 14 lines. Here's another one with a quote and 14 lines, and it deals with killings and violence and police brutality and things like that. So you can see what these people are thinking about. So now, I would like to make the point that you, Jeremiah Polachek, as a contemporary American artist, are pretty much the same age as these people. These people are between 40 and 50 for the most part, and that's where, and these are poets, and they're dealing with their own things that they're interested in, topics and forms and the like. And how much time do we have now?
7 minutes.
Okay. Well, one poet that I have enjoyed, even though I'm experience all of these, is a person named Chen Chen. And there's a picture of him. And this last year, the Best American Poems 2019, which is poems published in 2018, included his poem called I Invite My Parents to a Dinner Party. And I find this kind of fascinating. It's written in a very sort of accessible style, that it's not real complicated, and it tells a little story, and I'm going to have us look at this. And it has a little bit of a following, because every once in a while on YouTube there'll be his reading of it to a group of people, and people have discussed it and things like that. So I'm going to give you a copy of this. Here's a book of his, Chen Chen, titled When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a List of Further Possibilities. And I noticed, here's a nice picture of him, little clear too, nice in color. He seems to be working on a PhD in a university in Texas, and he is the poet in residence at Brandeis right now. And I did notice that a lot of these people work in creative writing programs in colleges and universities, and that's part of their lived world, So I'm going to read you have your copy of I Invite My Parents.
I have the same one?
The same one, so that we can see it, and I'll read it, and then we could have some fun with it and maybe watch a portion of an interview where he talks about it. I Invite My Parents to a Dinner Party by Chen Chen. In the invitation, I tell them for the 17th time, the 4th in writing, that I am gay. In the invitation, I include a picture of my boyfriend and write, You've met him 2 times, but this time you will ask him things other than, can you pass the whatever? You will ask him about him. You will enjoy dinner. You will be enjoyable. Please RSVP. They RSVP. They come. They sit at the table and ask my boyfriend the first of the conversation starters I slip them upon arrival. How is work going? I'm like the kid in Home Alone, orchestrating every movement of a proper family, as if a pair of scary yet deeply incompetent burglars is watching from the outside. My boyfriend responds in his chipper way. I pass my father a bowl of fishball soup. So comforting, isn't it? My mother smiles her best, sitting with her son's boyfriend, who is a boy smile. I smile my hooray for doing a little better smile. Everyone eats soup. Then my mother turns to me, whispers in Mandarin, is he coming with you for Thanksgiving? My good friend is... she wouldn't like this. I'm like the kid in Home Alone, pulling on the string that makes my cardboard mother more motherly, except she is not cardboard. She is already exceedingly my mother, waiting for my answer, while my father opens up a Boston Globe, when the invitation clearly stated no security blankets. I'm like the kid in Home Alone, except the home is my apartment, and I'm much older and not alone and not the one who needs to learn, has to remind me what's in that recipe again, my boyfriend says to my mother, as though they have always easily talked, as though no one has told him many times what a non-linear slapstick meets slasher flick meets psychological pit he is now co-starring in. Remind me, he says, to our family. How much time do we have now?
2.5 minutes.
Okay. We'll watch just a portion of a interview or conversation between Chen Chen and somebody else, just to have a better sense that this is this human being, Chen Chen, who he is, where this poem may have come from as a part of this modern world of young people who are writing at this particular time. So let's just hear it.
Control the direction of the piece so much.
Yeah. I really appreciate that partly too, because I think when people think about poetry, I talk about this a lot on the show as well, is they're afraid of it because they don't understand it, which assumes that they have to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, did you or someone else tweet about this recently?
Maybe. I think I did say something. It was like, sometimes a deer is a deer in a poem. And it doesn't have to be this riddle that you're decoding.
The riddle. It was, there was the treating poetry like a riddle.
Yeah.
Which then oftentimes, because people are putting themselves into the poem, you're treating the person like a riddle. Like, it's actually really violent.
Yeah.
You know? Like, to be you have to, here's the poem, and you have to solve the riddle of what it means, and because it represents this person's experience, you now
we
have
can
to,
stop at this
know
point.
this person's
Is there about
experience
40 seconds maybe?
Minute.
Oh, minute. A little bit later in this conversation, when he's talking about this poem particularly, he says that one of the very common expectations of what we'll call marginalized people is that their work would express triumph, like they have fought against their odds and they have succeeded, or tragedy, they're just suffering all the time. And so that's a common expectation, and he was finding ways to avoid it in himself. So in this poem, which is meant to be somewhat funny, it's humorous, one of his poetry mentors said, instead of writing a poem about you're going to see your parents, how about have them come to your house and you have expectations of them? And so here he has these parents who are not, they're kind of going along with it. And it's awkward and embarrassing for Chen Chen. But suddenly, his boyfriend turns to his mother and says, "Now, remind me," he says to our family, "what is this recipe?" And what impressed Chen Chen about that was that the boyfriend represents a separate source of power. So rather than he always have to triumph or his life sucks, I don't have to do all of this. My boyfriend, and it's kind of funny and clever that all of a sudden he said, and that so he's able to say, "Remind me," he says, to our family, so he can own the family and know we're all part of this, and that's kind of a surprise.
Cool.
Thank you.
So, today we're going to be talking about artist books and how-to manuals and artists' note-taking procedures as well, and how they all kind of blend into each other to create a new type of book. This is an image from Salvador Dali's artist how-to book called 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship. So Dali actually wrote this book and got it published. It was meant to be a book. It wasn't like Jack Whitten, for instance. Jack Whitten, when he wrote Notes from the Woodshed, those were his notes to himself. So we'll get into different types of styles of these types of books. So when we start out with the idea of what an actual artist manual is, and what its history is, and how these things are used. So when we start thinking about books, how do artists use books? That also relates to how do artists use writing in the creation of their work as well. So we can go to the Codex Urbinas, which is a treatise on painting in a collection of Leonardo da Vinci's writing, entered in his notebooks under the general heading On Painting. So here he was just writing a lot of different notes pertaining to the subject on painting. The manuscripts were gathered together by Francesco Melzi sometime before 1542 and first printed in French and Italian as Trattato della Pittura by Raphael Dufresne in 1651. The main aim of the treatise was to argue that painting was a science. So that's also in keeping a lot with what we would consider Leonardo da Vinci to be, who he is as an artist. He's somebody who is taking notes while he's painting, and he's figuring out what combination of materials do what, and what is the best way to create a glaze, and what is the best way to actually capture light and color and drapery and all these sort of things. And he's writing about subtle changes that he does every single day. So this work isn't really what we consider a book, though. You know, we have books all around on the walls here. This is kind of like a notebook, right? Like, this is a book of somebody's notes on a subject. It's not really made as an actual book. It was later created into this, which was an attempt more at a book. But in general, it's got notes, it's got illustrations in it. However, it's not laid out in a format that's meant to be digested as a book. It's clearly an investigative approach to learning about painting and taking note of different things. And oftentimes, a lot of artists will wonder, you know, what is the use of writing in terms of painting? And oops, I forgot to start the time, but I see that there, so I can do it based off that. What's the use in creating, you know, writings? If we're supposed to be painting, we should just be painting all day. But artists have been using writing for a really long time in the creation of their work and helping it to inform their work as well. Another person who did this is A. Boogert.
Unfortunate name.
Yes. How to Mix Watercolors, 1692. And in painting, there's this set, now we call it a Pantone. Have you ever heard of a Pantone?
I've heard that word.
It's basically just a collection of different tints and tones of different colors. And sometimes it's in a ring. Designers might use it to like put color up on the wall, or, you know, graphic designers would use it in the past to kind of flip through different colors and see which colors would work with one another. Or you can buy just a brick of paper that is like 250 different colors. So you can just see all these different colors. And they're kind of a good thing to have. So here we see with A. Boogert, he's creating a book about mixing watercolors. And he goes on to explain how to create certain hues and change the tone by adding 1, 2, or 3 parts of water. And the premise is really pretty simple. You know, he's just putting drops more of water in and looking at how that fluctuates and changes the color. Now with this book in 1692, you know, a problem is going to be who else can really use this book? Because you can't really print color that well, you know? So this is kind of a one-of-a-kind artist book in a sense, because you can't just print off all these different colors in 1692. There's no color reproduction methods. So this is a book that's designed just for one person or one institution probably to have. And they could reference, what does, you know, burnt sienna look like with 3 parts water in it? And this was, you know, done extremely methodically. There's 800 pages total, so there's thousands. There's probably like, if there's 5 on each page, there's probably 4,000 variations of color contained in that one book, which is kind of a cool approach to just making a book that combines some element of research, and then the book itself is the end product as well as an art piece too. In over 700 pages of handwritten Dutch, the author, who identifies himself as A. Boogert, describes how to make watercolor paints. He explains how to mix the colors and how to change their tone by adding the water. He wrote the book for educational purposes, though, so it's good to think about that when he's creating this book, he's creating it with the intent to educate somebody else, right? He wants people to get it. He doesn't, which we'll see with Salvador Dali. What is he trying to do with his artist book as a comparison? Here are some more stills from that. So from here, we can start thinking about the fact that when you're doing this type of work, what else is going on during this time is the rise of alchemy and mixing of 1 parts this and 2 parts cobalt and an old mink's eye and stuff like this, and burn it in a fire at 200 degrees on a full moon. But there is a lot of alchemical research, alchemy going on, and that's also a pursuit where the person is engaged in something that might be impossible, you know, turning lead into gold. It's kind of an impossible task in many respects. So painting is also kind of this impossible task, that you're dealing with all these very base elements, cadmium and cobalt and titanium and these sort of things, and you're mixing them together into creating something completely new that didn't exist before. And James Elkins, in What Painting Is, talks directly about this, and just, you know, water and stone, that a lot of the images that we see here, this is nothing but water and stone.
Mineral.
You know, that's made into powder, that's bashed into small little pieces, and that's all it is. So it's still these base ideas. James Elkins says, and as in painting, most of alchemy does not have to do with either pure water or hard stones, but with mixtures of the two. Alchemists worked with viscid stews. I can't move that for some reason, but you get the point. Brittle skins of slag. In short, they were concerned with the same range of half fluids as painters and other artists. And here we see the alchemist in his workspace in the David Teniers painting around 1650. And you can kind of see this space as at being, you know, functioning similarly to an artist's studio as well. James Elkins also wrote a book. Speaking of books and how-to books and art books, James Elkins also wrote a book called Why Art Cannot Be Taught. So you can see that James Elkins is also somebody who's writing a book about how you can't actually teach people in a book, or why you can't even teach people how to be artists. That's very different than Boogert. He thinks people are going to look and be like, oh, this is 3 parts water.
Mm.
So we come to a different place.
Ooh, this is nice pictures.
So now we get into artists' books as well, and the idea of what an artist book is. And William Blake is somebody who obviously created a bunch of books that responded to textual sources. In this illustration, this is an illustration of Psalm 18, in which David, at the bottom of the image with his arms stretched wide, calls out to God for salvation from his enemies. So he has a specific text that he's referencing in these things, and he's also even creating his own little cover and his own little text. He's kind of got his own font that he's created. So the whole book is kind of William Blake's book. We can also look to a lot of the avant-garde artists that were creating pamphlets and stuff like this in the run-up to World War I. Here's 2 images, various artists from Natalia Goncharova, Mikhail Larionov, and Nikolai Rogovin. Vladimir Tatlin, who you've probably heard of. So these were different kind of like zines, but they almost look like zines, and they kind of have this punk aesthetic to them as well.
Oh boy.
Dada itself was initially started in the Cabaret Voltaire by a group of exiled artists in neutral Switzerland during World War I. And it was originally influenced by the sound poetry of Vasily Kandinsky, the Blue Router Almanac that Kandinsky had edited with Mark, artists' book, periodicals, manifestos, and absurdist theater were central to each of Dada's main incarnations. So we can see a lot of these different types of zines that create. And here we see Destroy All Monsters, which was a Mike Kelly project in the 80s, and we can kind of see this similar look almost to these early World War II, World War I zines. You know, their text is kind of loosely put in here. There's simple illustrations. It kind of looks like this punk stuff as well. So here we see just some George Gross pieces. He's also making stuff against, you know, anti-capitalist pamphlets and small little books as well. Max Ernst playing around with the whole medium of photography, creating collages. And then we kind of get into these types of how-to books. And in these how-to books, we can see that we come to a point where artists' books are going to tell us something. And this is kind of a basic book from the 1930s or so. And the horizon line is always on a level with the observer's eyes. And I think that's just a really weird thing, but they were trying to make some sort of statement so people could see this and be like, oh, it's always on the point of your eye. There is some different how to paint and draw books. Here's a, you know, an old one from the turn of the century, how to paint and draw. It even has some sort of scientific, you know, markers. And here we see Salvador Dali's painting, how to draw book. Obviously quite different than this mathematical approach that he's taking. Loomis is really important. He taught a lot about how to draw heads and the skeleton and stuff like that. Still used in 3D design. these types of constructions of the head are still really important. How to draw a skull. Even somebody just ripped off basically and made a YouTube video. It has 5 million views, but it's all based on that how to draw method. Same as Loomis. And there's a lot of different types of self-help books, and a lot of these self-help books kind of consider painting to be something that's going to be relaxing, and it's going to be somewhere where you can find yourself. So oftentimes these self-help books about painting are also about like finding yourself or something like that. And you can find a lot of different information about these sort of things. So what Salvador Dali does when he creates his book, he's giving all these sorts of impossible tasks, right? And we see Bob Ross, who says, we like Bob Ross, but he says to paint this a certain way, this is how you brush things. And Dali would say, you need to go out hunting for sea urchins at 3 a.m. under the full moon. Or, you know, he had this self-paranoiac method where he would hold a key in his hand with a coffee pot on the ground and then sit in a chair, and then when he fell asleep, the key would fall into the coffee pot, and then you would draw your dream. So it's a different approach to creating a book and giving people lessons on how they should make art. Okay, we're rolling.
What time is it now?
8:27.
Oh, it's after 8. Okay. All right.
So,
Yeah, sure.
questions about the presentations.
I can.
You have
Oh, go ahead.
a bunch of people under 50. When did you start getting interested in poetry? Was there one book that made you become interested in it?
Wowie. I love talking and thinking about my entire life. And I spent a lot of time reflecting on my experience as a child in the 50s and then a youth in the early 60s. And you see that painting of me. I recall that I loved to read, but I would try to read these poems that were in like an old encyclopedia that were, and I usually didn't understand them. So it was a while before I could. Poetry itself was kind of a challenge, even though in 1960 I got this anthology. It was at a local drugstore. I can even grab it right now. There I won't. Of American poetry, starting with the Puritans up to a couple living people, W.H. Auden and somebody else. And I was able to read some of that, and I was 16 or so at the time. But
where did you get it?
The local drugstore. I think it was in Concordia, Kansas, because that's the only place in there. In fact, it's back there.
They would have them like in a swivelly thing.
Yes, it was just there along with the Pulp Fiction books. I mean, there were no bookstores. There were, so whatever book I bought then, like the Fellini book and the Kerouac and the Faulkner and the others, were all coming from a drugstore swivelly, or what do you spiral?
I don't know what you call them.
You know what I mean.
And then there'd be a library, probably.
Yes, but I wouldn't own those books, right? But I would say an important part of my story is that I love to read, and I learned to do Shakespeare quite early because I belonged to a Shakespeare record club, and that some of it's down there.
What Shakespeare? How old were you then?
Oh, 15, maybe 16. I was
Where did you see that? In a magazine?
It was an advertisement, and I asked my parents if I could order it, and then I got 25 condensed Shakespeare plays over the next one a month. So when I went to Bethany College and I was in a Shakespeare class, I was so ahead of the game because I knew 25 of those 36 plays already. I had heard it. I knew the story at least once and things like that.
But I just went to this book here.
What's that? Ah. This is a book of of articles written by Mr. Goddard on Shakespeare, and it's one of my favorite books of essays about Shakespeare plays. I still value this book to this. And there's a second volume to it, but
How old were you when you got that?
That probably already was in college. Maybe I was 18 or 19. It was probably at the local store of some kind in Lindsborg, Kansas. But no, I still value Harold Goddard as a writer about Shakespeare's plays.
So, getting into, you don't remember a first poet that you were kind of like, this is the person, though, that kind of got you into it?
A big influence, and I maybe I've told you this story before, even though Shakespeare's there, and I try to...
You can, I guess he is a poet.
I think it was in 1961. I'm 17, and I'm giving a lecture to a group of people on my mother's paintings at a local church, and she said, I don't want to do it. Why don't you do it? Of course. And so I've been doing these kind of adult presentations ever since I was a very young child. And there was a woman there who was a librarian in a high school.
How old were you?
Probably 17.
And you had to give a presentation.
Yeah, I hauled many of her paintings to this church basement, and there may be 25 or 30 women. There were women who want to be educated and who want to grow in culture and this kind of thing. I've lived with that kind of woman all my life. And there was a librarian there, and she said, you know, a person I think you would like is E.E. Cummings. And she introduced me to a specific poem. I could even show you that someday. A very avant-garde-ish modern poem by E.E. Cummings. And that really was a major intro to modernism. And he was still alive. He died the next year in 1962.
What were these presentations of her paintings?
I would haul a bunch of paintings and put them out.
You'd put them on the wall? Like
maybe lean them against chairs and things. We were in a basement of a church. I think it was a Lutheran church. And then I would explain, here, look at the... And it was interesting. There was a combination of realism, of a tractor or a cow, and over here is an abstract painting, and they were learning to appreciate that, oh, there is this world of abstraction, modern art that everybody knew was a problem, and oh, the modern art, my kid could do that kind of stuff.
Do you remember any interactions you had with people about her artwork during that time, or people that would comment on it?
Oh yes, but they would also come to the house. Tours would come to the house, and she would show them around and talk with them.
Yeah, where were those people coming from? Because that was her whole... I mean, the house being a gallery was kind of a deal.
People came.
I mean, she wrote it in the cement.
Yeah.
Remember, she had like earth music written in the cement out front.
Did she? Okay, I don't know.
But I mean, she kind of labeled it as a gallery.
Yeah, she wanted to see it as a gallery.
And where would those people come from? She kind of saw it as a cultural stop, didn't she?
Yes, absolutely. And there are people in any community, and I was learning this as a child in a Kansas, Nebraska world, people who wanted to learn and grow and are willing to try new things. So that was a part of my upbringing, and the combination was they respected her because she was an ordinary human being who was also known as somewhat unusual and eccentric, but not crazy.
Right.
But unusual. And
but she'd show up to the fair with a pie or whatever.
Yeah, she's able to cook, make a pie, make kolaches. Then they know she's a Czech person. I'm a very good pianist, and so this combination. I'm part of the community. I can do I try to do realism. I can try to do abstract expressionism kind of thing. I can have unusual subject matter that is unique to my experience as opposed to Mr. Ross, who seems to be doing like a body of water or clouds and mountains that don't seem to have anything to do with his own life. And I am right in the midst of that. Yes. Very significant.
So getting back to poetry.
Yes, and I have some questions for you on art.
Okay, we're halfway through. So
Well,
you
let me
can
just
me a
ask you,
question.
this business of you can't teach art to children, you have always...
No, that was James Elkin's book.
Okay, right.
Called Why Art Can't Be Taught.
Yeah, why art can't be taught. Wouldn't you say, even from a very primary elementary level, you've really taught Inca a lot? And could we say that when we saw Picasso working with his grandchildren, was he teaching them, or was he just sort of having fun with the grandchildren? And we're cutting things. There's a difference between we're having fun and I'm trying to teach them something. Would you speak on that, please?
I mean, the children aspect of it is kind of more difficult than, because kids have their own approach to art, which is better in a lot of ways, in terms of a sense of space, in terms of using the picture plane and filling it up and, creating like kind of strangely solid compositions. Kids are kind of naturally good. So I don't know if I would say I taught Inkle a lot, but I was I always made sure she had a ton of supplies. So there was always the big stack of copy paper. I would just buy a stack of that copy paper, and that's what she's always worked with. So we've boxes and boxes of her drawings and paintings, and I think she was 4 when I oil painted with her for the first time and stuff like that. So I think mostly it's like introduction to materials, and then
having the materials available,
having a space
as
available.
part of playtime.
Well, she's always had a desk.
Yeah. Oh.
A desk is kind of part of her life. Like a real part of her life where she sits and does stuff. And she's also into comic books now, so she's copying those things on her own and copying her Roblox characters, which I wouldn't know about. So, in some ways, the real meat of learning to paint and draw just comes from like a steady practice of doing whatever it is that you're doing.
She also made movies with you too.
She made all those Bippy and Boppy movies, yeah.
Right, and knew that you had to think of a story. What do you call it? A
storyboard.
Storyboard.
Oh, right. For storyboard, she's strangely good with storyboards, and as a result, she still cuts out a lot, which I don't think a lot of kids do. But she'll make a drawing and she'll cut it out and paste it on another drawing, or used it as a puppet on a drawing.
Kind of like a collage, and also that kind of art where the people do literally cut out things and make it work as a shadow puppet or something like that.
Right. So
Wowie.
That is kind of part of her thing. But yeah, I don't say I would say more like draw the corner of your room. She did that recently. She drew the corner of her room. But they just need practice, like with anything.
But that's a real assignment. Draw the corner of your room.
Yeah.
A prompt, or whatever you call it, that is actually...
It's based on life. It's observational drawing, which is helpful. Observational drawing and painting is always helpful.
As opposed to simply the symbol. I'm going to do I'm going to draw an eye, as opposed to I'm going to look at this person's eye and say, what does that look like? That's quite an extraordinary thing.
Yes.
Let me connect this to the world of teaching poetry. You may have noticed that a lot of these current poets have jobs in universities where they teach creative writing class.
Yeah.
That's they probably teach other things as well. But teaching a creative writing class is sort of the, meat and potatoes, or butter and bread of the current person who has a degree, who went to college, has a degree, maybe some of these have MFAs.
So is that a new thing though? Did Jack Kerouac teach?
I don't think he ever went to college, probably.
Allen Ginsberg? Maybe.
I think Ginsberg was more educated.
Yeah.
But this has raised a very important kind of issue, I think, about this, and that, because I want to get to this question of teaching art to adults, teaching poetry to adults, that Emily Dickinson did not teach in the local Boston University college. There was probably no English department anyhow.
Georgia O'Keeffe did. I mean, some famous painters did. A lot of famous
Right,
painters.
right. But and we could even trace this business of people, the academic world, the modern academy, the university and college, and the role of the, let's say, artists, musicians, composers, poets, novelists, and Whitman. I don't think he ever taught a course in his life. And the one poet in the 19th century in America who was absolutely a university person was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. You've heard that name, and maybe you don't know, but he was very good technically, and was very popular. People loved him, and he had many poems that are very, including Paul Revere's Ride, and things like that. He was I think it's Harvard, a university person.
Right.
And that by the time you get to the 1950s in America, that university is playing this enormous role in the life of America. And then you have these English majors who are then working, getting jobs in the university and the like. And when it comes to teaching poetry,
10 seconds.
Let me just say quickly, this book of poems is written by Timothy Murphy, who is from the Fargo area, and I think he's probably the best, most skilled poet that ever lived in North Dakota. He's alive today.
Okay.
And he's probably in his early 70s and is extremely skilled and quite sophisticated. And I'd like to make the point, when I heard him being interviewed about 3 years ago, he said he went to, I think, either Princeton or Yale or one of those famous places. I can't remember which one. And he studied with Robert Penn Warren, he wrote All the King's Men, that novel. He was an important poet. He was also a critic, and he also wrote books on teaching composition, with things like that. And Mr. Robert Penn Warren told Timothy that what he needed to do was to memorize 30,000 lines of poetry. I love this. It sounds outrageous, but it was, you must read and you must incorporate that language into your consciousness, as opposed to, perhaps, I'm not sure what these people read, and I'd like to find out what they're reading and how they feel about their reading, and all that kind of thing. But I was thinking that I know thousands of poems, thousands. And in a way, I kind of, including the Bible, including Shakespeare, and I don't memorize it all, but I kind of know what's coming next sometimes, or what came right before it. So, end of statement. And that might relate to what extent should the person studying painting, either as a major or not.
10,000 hours. You know that theory. 10,000 hours. Malcolm Gladwell kind of studied genius, and Mozart or Henry Ford or whatever. People that kind of became exceptionally good at something usually spent 10,000 hours doing it.
Yes. In conclusion, yes.